Working Cows Podcast, Episode 26.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
This episode has been brought to you by Chris Williams Audio. Check out his website at chriswilliamsaudio.com. For the last 11 years or so, I've been talking for a living. I've gained some skills in talking. I can form a sentence, I can think on my feet, I can respond to questions, I can come up with new questions. All that time developing my speaking craft has not left me a lot of time to figure out how to make audio sound great. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, making your product sound great is crucial. So you stick to what you know and let Chris Williams stick to what he knows, making your product sound great. Head on over to chriswilliamsaudio.com for all your podcasting, music production, and film audio needs. Hello, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast. Recently, Dallas Mount made a sabbatical trip to Australia and posted a bunch of different things on Facebook about that, and was just really an interesting trip. And he, while he was there, facilitated an opportunity for me to sit down with one of the directors of RCS Australia, that is a sister school to Ranching for Profit here in the States. And so I had an opportunity to sit down with David McLean. David is a general manager with RCS Australia, and he will give a little bit more of his background throughout the interview. So I will just let you get into the interview with David McLean of RCS Australia. David, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. I'd like to give you an opportunity to share a little bit of your history with the ranching in Australia and how you got started and how you came to be doing what you're doing today.
Very good. Thanks, Clay. Thanks for having me. So my background, fifth generation sheep and cattle producer from southwest Queensland. And so I've been in the family a long time out there, and that we don't really call them ranches, we call them properties or stations. That property's been run by my family and my eldest brother and my parents. I went to boarding school in Toowoomba in southeast Queensland. And then after that, after working around for a while to get a bit of money, went to uni and did a 4-year ag science degree at Gatton at University of Queensland. After which I was fortunate enough to have a few options about where to go and what to do, and could have gone into the banking sector or marketing. And out of all those, I decided I was still young enough and fit enough to go and work on a property up in North Queensland. And what attracted me to that property was that I didn't understand what they did, even though I'd grown up on the property and just done this ag science degree. What they did, I didn't quite understand. They did all the strange things up there.
Sure.
And so I decided to go up there, and that's when I got introduced to RCS, was as a client. And so I spent a few years up there working on that property. It's a 75,000 acre property, so it's similar size to what I'd grown up with. About 100 k's from town, 100 kilometres, which is 70 miles from town, which is similar to what I'd grown up with as well. And but then the similarity stopped, and I ran cattle. But outside of that, the way they approached business and the way they approached agriculture was very different to the what I'd grown up with. They used pretty intense or varying stages of intensity of time control grazing in that system there. So we had on that property we had 188 paddocks, and we ran from 3.5 to 7,000 head of cattle, just depending on the season. The landscape up there, so Australia, as with the States, has got a huge variation in landscapes, topography, environmental conditions, timing of seasons, etc. There's exactly the same variation. It's just we don't have as much country that has as extreme winter as you do there. You get a few patches down south that do, but generally we're a more milder climate.
Sure.
For us up there, we worked on about a 2-month growing season and then a 10-month non-growing season. So January and February were our wettest months, and we typically got all our rainfall through there. It's a pretty hot, humid climate up there. Topography-wise, latitude-wise, I don't know what you'd compare it to. Longitude-wise, with the states, I'd have to look on a map there now, but it'd be the lower parts of Texas and that sort of line there, I'd imagine. And so based on that wet season, that growing season I was talking about, that if we missed a wet season, well, then we had to bring our numbers right back. And if we had a good wet season, well, then we could really ramp our numbers up.
Sure.
And we did that through, we call adjustment, which you guys call custom grazing, and through holding on to grower animals as opposed to sending them somewhere else, which was our strategy. So anyway, I worked up there for a while, and it literally changed my life going up there and when working with the people that I worked with there.
What were some of the things that were different? You said that you didn't understand any of the things that they were doing, and was it everything from economic analysis to grazing strategies and those things that were different than what you had grown up with, or what were some of those things?
The grazing strategies was the main one that really attracted me to go up there, and I just wanted to understand it. I didn't understand it. So they talked about this cell grazing stuff, and to me, cell grazing was the sort of thing that you could do on small properties and hobby farms, but you couldn't do that on bigger properties. That was the paradigm that I had, and so I wanted to go and see what it looked like. And so for them to have, they ran, in the time that I was there, we were running 1,600 to 1,700 cows in one mob, and or breeders in one mob, and moving them around every 1 to 3 days, just depending on the time of the year.
Wow.
And the paddock they were in. And so in real terms, that's pretty intense. And if you compare that to a lot of country, a big part of Australia would have the bigger mob sizes would be 80 to 120 cows in a mob.
Wow.
And that'd be probably more year-long grazing and set. And some people got smaller and some people got bigger, but on average it'll probably be in that region there. And it'll all be based on what the water can support. So if that water can support 80, 120 cows for that year, well, then that's what they put on that area. So for us to be having those sorts of numbers together, there wasn't too many people in the north that do it.
Sure.
They started doing that in their mid-90s. That particular property I was on, there was mid to late 90s is when they first started to develop their country. They also use dogs extensively, so kelpies and collies, so working dogs extensively with them. And I'd grown up on a sheep and cattle property. We used dogs a lot with sheep, but again, my paradigm and what I'd seen is that it didn't use dogs a lot with cattle. And so to understand how that could work and the role that they played in that business and the efficiencies. And so we ran that business with 2 to 3 full-time labour units and then a couple of contractors outside of that.
Wow.
And so the dogs were an important part of that. So understanding that was a big part.
Sure. You talk about them developing that country. What do you mean by that? I mean, are you talking fences and water?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
What did that look like as far as fences and water? Is there a kind of a central water location, and then you've got a pie? It's that it goes out from that section, or are you moving water to the cows? Or
no, it was all permanent water that was put in place there. So that particular property had a lot of really good underground water. And so the artesian basin, which we call it, so we had pressurised water to the surface. So we could actually water a lot of the property without having to turn a pump on, which was just such a massive asset for that country and for so much country in Australia that does have that. So we had water at 2 central locations there. This, as was the design back then, a lot of it was wagon wheel. And remember, this was developed more than 20 years ago. The wagon wheel approach was what was used back then. However, now some of the older country or more recent country that have been developed up there, we're starting to take a bit of a different approach. But in reality, a lot of it had central watering point. In some places, 22 paddocks coming in onto that one water, which is too intense. It time again would definitely design that property differently. But the fence and water was a big part of it. But we worked out there in the later stages. We had about 2,300 kilometres of internal fencing, which I'd have to convert that back. It'd be about probably 1,600 mile of internal fencing, I'd say, and mostly single wire electric fencing.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of other things. Working with dogs, were they using the dogs to move the cows from paddock to paddock, and that was cutting down on the need for permanent labor units? Is that the idea?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. There was two parts to it. One was using the dogs to educate the animals, to actually have the animals in a good frame of mind so that they were settled in the paddock. And for me, if you had a group of animals in the paddock, you want them head down, bum up,
right,
putting on kilos so we can sell them.
Yep.
We don't want them trotting, moving around the paddock, stressing about whether they're going to be in the next paddock, stressing about stuff. It's about trying to remove the stress factors for them, and that's educating them to be able to handle stress. So dogs were brilliant at being able to reduce that flight zone and educate those cattle for that. And the other one was absolutely, as you said, labour efficiency. There's a couple of real moments that I remember. There's one day I went out by myself. I probably took out 4 or 5 dogs with me that day, which is usually the number that would have taken to a job, and picked up this mob. I think there's about 1,700 cows in the mob. Went in, they probably would have been in a paddock, a heavily timbered paddock, could have been 150 hectares, so 300-400 acres, and went out and mustered the paddock, walked them all to the corner, moved them all through into the new paddock, settled them in the new paddock, and then went and did all the fencing by myself, just checking the fence in the new paddock. And there's another moment that myself and another bloke, we picked up a mob of about 3,000 head of cattle and walked them through some really heavily timbered country for a few kilometres, from one water point to another water point to shift them. And I got to the other end there, and it occurred to me that the 2 of us had just walked this pretty decent mob of cattle through heavily timbered country. We weren't stressed, the animals weren't stressed, and we were absolutely confident that we hadn't lost any animals. And the fact is shown that the cattle were very good in the head. They were very well-educated mob of animals, and so they didn't want to be anywhere else. And with both those occasions, me moving that mob of cows and calves, that was 1,700 cows and calves in one mob getting moved by one person through timbered country and into different paddocks, and mustering wasn't just moving them from one yard to another in a set of cattle yards. That and picking up that big mob. If somebody had told me 2 years before that date that, oh yeah, by the way, you'll be doing this, what are you drinking? There's no way I would have ever believed that you could do that. So pulling all that together and to see what was happening on this landscape and to see how it responded, and talking to the owners of the property there, they talked about the carrying capacity of that country was double what it was traditionally. And so to pull all that together and see it, and to see how exciting it was and what was possible, it really excites me.
Very cool.
It still does.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm excited right along with you. We had Kurt Pate on episode number 12 of the Working Cows podcast, and he said that a good stockman keeps the cow's head down. Yeah. That was his measure of a good stockman, if you keep the cow's head down. So I thought that was I was thinking about that today, a good, simple way to think about it. So
yeah, good. Very simple's good.
Yeah, I agree very much. I got just a couple of general questions, and then we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the drought that you were talking about and how you guys managed through that. But what are some of the typical management practices, or what are the management practices that you at RCS are encouraging folks to employ, as far as how a calf hits the ground, how long is it with its mother before it's weaned, and then where does it go from there, and some of those things?
Yeah, sure. Huge variation in that, depending on. So we work right across Australia. So we're dealing with hot climates, cold climates, winter and summer rainfall, or autumn, spring rainfall, or just summer rainfall. So the answer to that completely depends. If we talk through the north, and you guys will have to remember that that's the opposite of what. Because of the other hemisphere. I know that took me a bit when I was over in the States a few years ago. He goes, oh yeah, no, when you head north, it gets really cold. And I think, no, that's not right. When you go north, it gets hot. So when you get up into the northern parts of Australia, or northern Australia, you've got your more monsoonal rainfall patterns. So in that area there, you're going to have summer dominant rainfall and an extremely low probability of any winter rainfall. to the point where it used to be a bit of a running joke that you could go and get your rain gauges in April and go and put them in the shed until November so the sun didn't affect them too much. In those areas there, you'd be looking to be carving. I'll talk about the property I was on there by way of example. We worked out that our key date, so 7 years out of 10, our green season would have started by this date. So it's one of the key factors that we look at for people in any breeding program. So our key date there was early January, about the 7th of January. That was the number that we decided on. So we wanted to have finished calving by that date. And we pre-tested our herd back into a 60-day calving period. And so our bulls would go in about the 1st of February in that climate there. And January and February were our wettest months. So we usually had a flush of green feed coming through for those cows. A lot of this is your Jim Wiltbank principle. So in answer to your question about what we teach with reproduction, we take the Jim Wiltbank stuff and then we've added another 3 or 4 principles on the back of that. And so our teaching's largely based on the findings by Jim over there.
Sure.
So the bulls in for us there was 1st of Feb, and we didn't pull the bulls out on a particular date. We'd leave them in and then preg test back into our window. And I still find in a lot of climates, particularly through the north here, when you're more extensive, that's a good strategy because you've got options then with those animals that didn't preg test into your window. You can sell them as a PTIC cow, pre-tested in calf cow, or you can still send it to works if that's what you wanted to do, or you've got options. But if you pull those bulls out, all you've got is an empty cow.
Sure.
And then with regards to how long to leave them on the cow, it all comes down to the body condition score of that breeder. So we use a 1 to 5 scale for body condition score, and so we want our cows and body condition score 3+ at calving. So if you have a really good season and that condition score on that cow's been held up nicely, then absolutely you leave them on through the north there. That might extend out to May, June. You come back into central Queensland near where I live now, that could extend out to July, maybe August in a really good year. So in terms of how long you can leave that breeder on, and they'll be calving a bit earlier when we come down here as well. So through this more central Queensland region, the timing just changes, but we're still trying to aim to be finished calving around that green date, key date. In different years, so there's one of the years on that property I was on, we had to wean in February. So we went in, and because we missed our wet season, we didn't get a growing season. So we went in, and the average weight of one of our weaners was 86 kilos, 2.2, isn't it? Yeah, 180, 190. And that we did that purely to maintain condition score in the cows because we didn't have the nutrition in that system there to keep that weaner on that cow. And we got the reward from that is that the conditions we kept on those breeders enabled us to get a high preg test again that year and the year after. And so it's that next year that really comes back to bite you if you get that one wrong.
Right.
And the economics of trying to put that condition score back on that cow, the amount of energy we would have had to have brought in on a truck, and we would have had to have been trucking that sort of nutrition for 1,000 miles, probably 500 or 1,000 miles, depends on what we were bringing in. So the economics of trying to feed that nutrition back onto the cow just wouldn't have worked. It would have killed any business. So weaning is that strategy for it.
Yeah, makes sense.
The answer depends. You get down into more southern Australia, and they're going to be like a lot of parts in America there where they'll basically pull off the weaner. They'll be using more Angus cattle. We're using a lot more tropical cattle through the north, and they'll basically pull off a weaner, and that cow will be in third trimester again, and she'll only be a few months off calving. So they leave them on for a lot longer, better nutrition.
Right.
But the same variability as what you'll be finding over there.
Sure. Well, this is episode 26 of the Working Cows podcast. So the show notes page will be workingcows.net/26. And if I can find a link to the Wiltbank principles, I will put that in there and allow people to see some of those principles about bringing upping the percentage of breed up and some of the fertility things that you were mentioning there, and I'll put a link there to some information about that. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to talk a little bit more after the break about the drought responsiveness and some of the ways that you guys prepare and manage for those drought a little bit more than we already have. So we'll be right back. The High Plains Ranch Practicum is an invaluable resource. I cannot stress highly enough how much I think it is important for producers to be involved in continuing education programs. So go check out the High Plains Ranch Practicum at hpranchpracticum.com and register. The class that I was a part of sold out before the deadline, and so the deadline is the end of May. But go ahead and register early and make plans to be a part of this. Just a great format for continuing education for ranchers. hpranchpracticum.com, our newest sponsor on the Working Cows podcast. And we're back with David McLean from RCS in Australia, and we are talking to him today just about the kind of the Australian ranching industry and how RCS has been challenging some paradigms and some of the things that they do a little bit differently. You were mentioning before about weaning calves at 180 pounds or 86 kilos, something like that, because there wasn't nutrition available to keep them on the cow, to keep the cow in good body condition score, and that if you were going to keep them on the cow, you would have to truck energy or hay or some kind of a feed source from 1,000 miles away or 500 miles away. Would that be the typical response for some ranchers in Australia, or is it oftentimes the same strategy of take the calves off early?
I think early weaning and harsh weaning is a tool that isn't used widespread anywhere near to its potential. I still see, and the variability of seasons is really a major issue for people to be able to manage. And so driving around and flying around the country, there's a lot of places I go to where they'll have really poor cows and big sappy weaners still running on them and not a lot of nutrition out in the paddock. And I do honestly believe everybody operates to the best of their knowledge. People are doing the best they can with the knowledge they have and the skills that they've got. But I think that early weaning could be used a lot more, and because that situation, you got that poor cow and a big sappy weaner, she's not going to come back in calf again, and you're only going to be knocking around your country. I think one of the other factors that we teach people that is still underappreciated, I believe, is the difference in stocking rate from going from a wet cow to a dry cow. So as soon as you will pull that weaner off, her feed requirements pretty well halve. And so if you were to wean and sell the weaners, if you had a really poor season, a low growing season, you can literally halve your stocking rate very quickly by doing that. And that's a massive lever that we've got available to start to pull us out of some tight situations if the rainfall hasn't come when we may have liked it.
So how do you prepare, or what are some of the tools that you're using to be prepared to destock before it's too late?
Yeah.
What are some of the tools that you guys are using?
One of the main ones is the grazing chart. And so one of the things we look at the bottom of the grazing chart, so we use it as a monitoring tool, and right down the bottom, one of the things we look at the bottom of our grazing chart is looking at the relationship between feed removed and rainfall received. And we find that's a really powerful tool to be able to look at what's that water use efficiency. So it can take a couple of years to get confident in certain areas, but once you know what your water use efficiency, so we'll talk about what's a stock day per hectare per 100 mils of rain. I know Dallas and those guys with RMC talk about stock days per acre per inch. So it's the same concept of that. And we do a lot of work on projecting that out and forecasting that out. And that's one of the main tools that gives us an indication, well, hang on, the season isn't what we thought it was. The rainfall pattern hasn't quite come through. And so therefore, how are we actually tracking? What's that forecast? And if our forecast stock days per hectare per 100 mils is starting to really rise up and increase, well, we know that we need to start doing something now and not wait until down the track. And you can, if you know what your benchmark carrying capacity is in SDH per 100 mils, then you can track what your stocking rate is and look what that is. And whenever that goes over the top, whenever your stocking rate exceeds carrying capacity in there, it's a bit like putting money on a credit card. You can do it, and you can do it for a while, but eventually you're going to have to pay that money back, and usually at pretty high interest rates. So that longer term cost behind it is pretty significant. So that's one of the tools we look at. Then I've had a number of clients just the year that's just gone. We didn't get a great start to the summer rainfall through our northern Australian parts here. It's only been in the last few weeks that's changed, and so we. I think some of my leading clients and the really good thinkers amongst them started to make a lot of decisions back in December, early January, and sold significant numbers of cattle back then, just to buy some room in the properties, make sure they always still had feed in front of them, to take risk out of the business, and now they're in a situation there where they're back in the buying cycle again. And I think a lot of people were held off too late. They lost productivity in those animals, and then they were forced to sell when the market was starting to really drop because the rainfall didn't come. So stock days per hectare, 100 mils is one of the main ones. And just that forecasting about what your numbers are and knowing what you've got and keeping a really close eye on what you've actually got in the paddock. We talk about dealing with what you do have, not with what you hope to have. And there's a big difference between those two.
Right. Yep. So, well, you got to be honest, right? That's kind of what you're talking about there. You got to be honest with yourself about what you actually do have as opposed to what you hope to have. One of the other things that I think is very interesting about the dynamics of your situation is the fact that, you know, in America we might miss some rainfall here and there, but we probably won't miss it for a year at a time. And what are some of the things that people are doing in those cases? You mentioned custom grazing earlier. Some of the other things that you mentioned were pulling the weaners off early, or do a lot of people on these bigger stations or bigger properties, ranches, do they keep those calves? Do they run those calves in a separate herd?
Yeah.
Once they wean them, is that how they work that?
Yeah.
Okay, and so there's another lever point, I guess, for drought. Can you talk a little bit about managing for extended drought?
There's a number of different lever points that you could look at there. The prevalence to drought changes by district quite a lot. So we've got some clients who were looking down the barrel of their 6th and 7th missed growing season. So they've basically gone 6 and 7 years without growth or significant growth. And that, I don't care who you are and where you're from, that's tough to manage for and that's tough to plan for. You don't know when those times are going to come. So we've got fair chunks of Australia where that's a very real probability. And there's other areas not far from them that have probably had 2 good growing seasons in 12 years. And so there's some areas that are, in terms of reliability of rainfall, they're not there. So if you're carrying any debt in those landscapes there, it's really tough to manage through that. One of the first things when it comes to drought management is to accept that drought's normal. So we do a lot of work in our schools on that mindset, the mindset behind drought and how they approach it. And one of the first things we talk about is that rainfall is variable. And so a lot of the language that you hear in a traditional approach here is that if I can just get a couple of normal years, or if I can just get a couple of average years, I'll get back on track again. And so they might say, my landscape here it's 15-inch country or it's 18-inch country. But that might be made up of some years that have 50 inches and some years that have 4 inches. And so you're going to have that variability. And, that's the extremes, and it'll sit in a band a bit tighter in the middle. That's reality. So I just challenge groups that if your business is only designed to be profitable in an average rainfall year, you're actually setting yourself up to fail because that doesn't exist. Yeah. You only get average rainfall years as you're going into periods of higher rainfall and coming back down them again into periods of lower rainfall. And so an average season is, I call it a unicorn. It just doesn't exist. So we've got to accept that now. Different regions have different variabilities. All through your more Eastern Australia strip, the closer you are to the coast, and you're probably more reliable seasons there, where you're going to get some growth every year, and the probability of not is extremely low. And then the closer you get into the centre of Australia, which is essentially a big desert, then the rainfall, the timing of rain and the amount of rain is extremely variable. You don't know what you're going to get when. And so your management strategies around what you run needs to change with it. So if you're in a really variable country and you want to have a breeding program, then simple tools you can look at is that, okay, if you're going to make sure you've got 12 months worth of feed in front of you if you're running breeders. You've got to have that haystack built up out in the paddock there to go on to. Because if you start getting back and getting short, the real pinch point a lot of people find themselves in is they start running out of feed at that point in time when the animals are calving. When your options are extremely limited in that point in time there. So, making sure you've got a decent haystack. The other one is just reducing the proportion of breeders in your herd and having more readily saleable cattle. Now, everything's sellable, but usually in a lot of people, we love our breeders and we enjoy having our breeding cows, and we don't want to sell them. And so in that case there, we'll have that group of animals there that you absolutely want to keep, but make sure that you can run them in the poorest of seasons. And then everything above that, you've got to be willing to do something else with in a drought situation. And we talk about having a destocking policy. So we do a lot of work with people on drought plans. So what's your destocking policy? You have that decision made in advance that when your rainfall patterns drop and you don't get as much rain, and they'll say when, not if, when that happens, what is the order you're going to drop your numbers by? Which this group of animals are going to go first, then those ones, and you're left with usually your core breeders, and you could be able to get them through to the end of the drought period, however long that is, with your country still in good condition, and your animals still in good condition, and your bank balance still in good condition as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of opportunities in drought if we're looking for them. Now, those guys going in their 6th and 7th year, it's a bit harder to find those, and so therefore you've got to have that's accepting that could happen also needs to be built into your strategy as well.
Sure. Well, and so much good stuff there. I really appreciate that. That you mentioned there that as you're making your plans, your plan has to take into account the fact that I want to maintain body condition on these breeders. I want to maintain my soil health so that there's good health in that soil so that it will grow when it does get rain.
And see that recovery,
I haven't damaged it because I'm trying to eke by or get through with these cattle, rather than having that plan in place and be ready to ship the ones out that are at the top of that list that are most saleable. And that's just good strategy, good stuff. I really appreciate that.
I was talking with one of my colleagues last week at our Executive Link program, and he'd just done some travelling through Western Queensland and some of the regions that he'd been in there, and he was deeply concerned about just the damage that's been done to that country through, they have had periods of lower rainfall. However, at the same time, they've had too many mouths. And the mouths have been in a number of different forms. The kangaroo pressure in some of that area is absolutely significant. You've got one client out there who talked about a 15,000 acre property that had 15,000 kangaroos on it. And they eat a significant amount of feed, and they're one of the issues. But then there's also, in some cases, too many domestic livestock on there as well. And the impact on the ecology out in that country their water use efficiency has dropped. So they are going to need significantly more rain moving forward to be able to get back to any significant amounts of growth again. So there's a lot of area there, and that's in trouble. And I compare that to some photos I'm getting coming through of clients out there who have implemented the principles really well, and they've got a power feed coming away in front of them. Their water use efficiency, I'm guessing, could be 3 to 4 times better than a lot of other people in the district because of the different decisions that they've made.
Yeah,
so it's pretty powerful, and the multiplier effect there now in those really extreme weather conditions is enormous.
Yeah, and honestly, that's a conservative estimate: 3 to 4 times water use efficiency. We've had Tim Hoven from Canada on the podcast recently, and he talked about a test of the soil, the water infiltration in the soil that was done by Shell Oil Company on his property, and there were some of that was 80 times higher than his neighbor's place.
Wow!
Because they've been doing this cell grazing for 20 years, and right across the fence, it's year-long grazing. And so some of those things. Can we talk just a little bit as we prepare to wrap up here, a little bit about the scale of these places and some of the advantages that brings as far as overheads and some of those different things that we're all having to manage for?
Yeah. Again, with the different districts in Australia, you're going to have different scale. Through Queensland, your average beef producer is going to be running around about 2,000 standard animal units. That would be the average. Your top 20 are probably getting up to that 2,500 to 3,000, just that little bit more scale. Large stock units, your standard animal units. The further north you get, you're going to have operations that are running 10, 20,000 head of cattle, and then you get onto some properties that are running significantly more than that when you get through parts of northern Australia. When you get down into southern Australia, that's where you're probably more getting into your more smaller herds of 300 to 400 cows in that range through there. However, the byproduct of that and those properties that don't have the acreage to run bigger mobs of cows and the cost factor behind that land, a lot off-farm income is an essential ingredient in that to support the lifestyle. It's actually not a living area. So that in that 2,000 to 3,000 standard animal units is about where we see a living area being. Some of those bigger places, you do get to a situation of diseconomies of scale. I reckon there's a bit of a dangerous area there where they're just not quite big enough to go to the next level, but they're a bit too big for what they've got, and therefore they can't manage the herds they've got. So there is that middle area there that is a bit dangerous. There is a need to run it on really skinny overhead bases. So we talked about labour efficiencies. Our benchmark is our aim is about one labour unit to 1,500 units, so 1,500 head approximately. That's about where we've got to be. And if we're not, if we're going to have less efficiency than that, then we need to have a really high gross margin enterprise that we're running to be able to afford for that higher labour unit. And some of the stud businesses are able to do that. But if you're not a stud business, then we need to really look at strategies to how we can share those overheads around a bit more.
Those would be people raising bulls or seed stock stud businesses, right? Okay.
Yeah. We've got a few of them making money. Unfortunately, the stud industry isn't really what I call a profitable industry.
Right.
And most of the studs we analyse are actually losing money off that seed stock business.
Yep.
So,
and is it similar to here? A lot of the guys that are raising bulls here are calving early and selling yearling bulls rather than calving later and selling coming 2-year-old bulls. So there's a lot more inputs into that early calving herd. Is that kind of similar to what you guys are experiencing there?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a huge amount of money that goes into feeding these bulls up for sale, which is pretty sad. I think that's where the industry's got to. We've got these animals that are just fed up and fed up on grain, and their gut isn't adapted to eating pastures when they go out to the property to work. So we've got to feed them back down, and we run the risk in a lot of places. And yet all of our businesses that do seed stock production, they'd love to not have to feed their cattle, but they know that if they don't, they're not going to get paid.
Right.
So it's a commercial industry that needs to shift their approach on this, and we also need to make sure we're focused on profit and not productivity.
Right.
And so that shifts that approach to what's the seed stock businesses are only providing what the commercial industry are going to pay for. So we can't blame studs. We need to look at the commercials.
Yeah, it's a lot, supply and demand. It is kind of a universal truth, I would say. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time today. It's been a great discussion. Anything else that we didn't cover? I mean, obviously lots of things we didn't cover, but anything that we needed to hit a little bit more clearly or make a little bit more clear in your mind as far as some of the stuff that we covered?
I think it's with every district that you're in, every state, every part of Australia, just like over there, you're going to have variability. And that's the only bit that's constant. You don't know what's going to happen and when. And so it's a matter of, I believe that it's important that we've got a strategy in place there to manage variability as being normal, and we need to accept that variability is normal. And so all of these things that we've just talked about, and we've talked about some extreme cases there, and the businesses that are doing really well are the ones that are just looking at what they've got in front of them and making the best decisions with what's there. And they're thinking out in front a lot more. They're not managing behind. They're not externalising what is or isn't going on and blaming markets or prices or input prices or anything like that. It's really looking at, okay, well, how do we manage these conditions to get the best out of what we have? And so they're good people managers, they're good land managers, they're good grazing managers, they're good business managers. They know what's making the money and what's not, and not assuming that this is still the not right aspect. And they're really challenging themselves and their businesses. I think if we're not, we talk a lot about professional-based management and principle-based management. And if you're not a professional manager implementing these principles, then you're much greater risk of actually being pushed out of the industry because you may not be profitable moving forward. And then probably the closing thought there is the strategies that may have worked generations before. So what grandmother and grandfather did and great-grandma and great-grandpa, etc., the strategies that were really profitable for them may not be the best ones for now. It doesn't make them wrong. They were probably good at the time.
Right.
But we just need to shift with the times. And I think as an agricultural industry around the world, we can do that better.
Sure. No, so much good stuff. I really appreciate all of that. One of the things that a constant drumbeat here on the Working Cows podcast is adaptability or variability, being able to change with the season. But I think that the key piece that you really drove home there is that you've got a strategy in place before the variation happens, before the variability happens. I've got a strategy in place and I know what I'm going to do when it happens, not if it happens, because as you said earlier, average is a unicorn. And that's a really good point, and I appreciate your time today. How can people keep up with what you guys are doing there in Australia with RCS and any links that you would like me to share? I would be happy to do that. So what are some of those things that if people wanted to see what's going on, how could they get in touch with what you're doing?
The best way for people to keep in touch with what we're thinking and what we're doing would be to go to the website, rcsaustralia.com.au. And there's a newsletter there, so people can just subscribe to that. We put that out every 1 to 3 months when we've got some good information and stories to share. So that's a really nice way. And if anyone's ever coming over to Australia, well, we've got plenty of events free as well as the schools and etc. We'd love to have you guys involved in that. And so if you want to do a trip over here, let us know.
Sure. Very cool. I will have links to all those things at workingcows.net/26. David, thank you for your time today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
This episode has been brought to you by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. Here's the deal about Kamak Ranch Supply. When you call and ask them about a product, there's no blank pause on the other end of the line because they don't understand the product that you just asked them about. If they are selling it, they understand it because they are producers, and Gary Kamak himself, the owner of Kamak Ranch Supply, is a producer. So if you want answers about the products you're calling to ask about from producers, call Kamak Ranch Supply or check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. Really appreciate Dallas Mount for facilitating that interview, as well as David for taking the time to sit down with me. It was a little difficult to coordinate because they are 17 hours ahead of us there in Australia. So it was an interesting thing to coordinate that, but they came in and were ready to go early, and I was here in late afternoon, and we did it, and it was just an enjoyable time. So I appreciate that. Again, rcsaustralia.com is their website, and links to that will be at the show notes page, workingcows.net/26, and some other things there that will be linked as well. So check out the show notes page at workingcows.net/26. And up next week, we have an episode with Bob Howard from Idaho. He's doing some really interesting things there with linebred genetics and crossbred genetics, and just some really interesting benefits that they're seeing from that. So I encourage you to tune in next week for episode 27 of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.